From the Journeys of Belonging to Blackness digital media project, I'm Yndia Lorick-Wilmot, and you're listening to the podcast, Talking Journeys of Belonging to Blackness. Welcome. It's Thursday, June 4th, 2020. Listeners and supporters of my digital media project, Journeys of Belonging to Blackness, understand the intention of my work is to highlight and uplift the lives and positive experiences of African descendants. These several weeks have left me and so many feeling outraged and heartbroken at the events occurring across our country. COVID-19 and the current uprisings across the United States make my work not only challenging, but ever so necessary. I endeavor to use this platform as a means to inform and inspire actions that can end the racial injustices that permeate society against Black and brown bodies today. Joining us in conversation are three nationally recognized scholars and practitioners whose scholarship around issues of race, community, and equity sit at the praxis of service and social justice. At the crux of their work, the scholarship, their art, activism, and spiritual practices is the intention to elucidate and dismantle the systemic structures that allow inequality to remain a fixture in our society, in the US and globally. Joining us, we have Dr. Vilna Bashi Treitler. She is professor in the Department of Black Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara, a sociologist and visual artist. She is the author of several books, including The Ethnic Project, Transforming Racial Fictions into Ethnic Factions, which was named to the Zora Canon as one of the best 100 books ever written by an African-American woman. Vilna is the 2020 recipient of the American Sociological Association's Cox Johnson Fraser Award for Scholarship in Service to Social Justice. Welcome, Vilna.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Next, we have Dr. Lorenzo Boyd. He is Assistant Provost for Diversity and Inclusion at the University of New Haven, Director of the Center for Advanced Policing, and Associate Professor in the Criminal Justice Department. A former law enforcement officer in the Sheriff's Department in Massachusetts, Lorenzo is an author of articles such as Black Lives Matter, the Watchdog for the Criminal Justice System, and a nationally recognized leader in police community relations, urban policing, diversity issues in criminal justice, race and crime, and criminal justice systems. Welcome, Lorenzo.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
And we have joining us Dr. Courtney Desiree Morris. She is a social anthropologist and an assistant professor of gender and women's studies at the University of California at Berkeley, a contributor to the American Anthropologist, Asterix, and the Journal of Gender and Families of Color. Her work focuses on topics of critical race and feminist theory and Black social movements in the Americas. In addition, Courtney is an activist and a visual conceptual artist in the fields of photography, experimental video, and performance art. Welcome, Courtney.
Thank you. It's good to be back on the program.
Yes. And thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules. I mean, even as we record this, Dr. Boyd, you are sort of balancing being on this program as well as filming live with your local syndicate of Fox News Channel 61 as they are broadcasting the funeral of George Floyd. So for our listeners and viewers out there, when this gets released on YouTube, let me clarify, Dr. Boyd will be joining us for the first half of this conversation. So we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Before we dive into our conversation, we are in fact living in a world that is in crisis, and our community is angry, frustrated, and heartbroken, making efforts to carry on with our day-to-day operations feel like a Herculean task. And so before we proceed, I would like to ask for a moment of silence for George Floyd and all those who have lost their lives under police brutality. Thank you. So let's start right now. Okay, so we can all agree that systemic racism has driven so much historical and contemporary violence against the Black community, right? Yet again, led us to this breaking point. We witnessed Amy Cooper's attempt to weaponize the NYPD against birder Christian Cooper. We watched George Floyd's murder at the hands of police who are sworn to protect and serve. And of course, this was on the heels of Ahmaud Arbery's murder, which was on the heels of Breonna Taylor's, all of which has occurred in the last 2 months where everyone is supposed to be self-quarantined in the context of COVID. The dehumanizing policies, the language, the actions of this administration and so many police departments around the country, the tragedy of COVID and its toll on Black, brown, and Native people in the United States, and of course, the long history of violence and systemic racism have revealed not only injustice and inequity, but also a deep level of grief and anger that has become too much to bear when it comes to the perpetual loss of life and the persistent unequal treatment of Black people. We are living in a state of emergency, a kind of apartheid America. Can you each briefly talk about the personal and the professional ways you and your work have been impacted, not only by COVID, but the state of COVID that we're living in, but as well as in the context of the recent rebellions, uprisings across many US cities?
If I may start, one of the things that I noticed, and it was an unintended consequence of what I do. For the last 20 years, I spend time building bridges between the police and the community, particularly communities of color. And I do police training, usually about 200 hours per year. I train police officers across the country. So when COVID hit, my first thought was selfishly, I get a break. I get a respite from doing all the traveling, doing the things that I'm doing. What I didn't realize is during COVID, the masking of America, that hits really differently when you're Black. So now we're dealing with young Black men who unfortunately society has determined were symbolic assailants and people that were to be feared to begin with. And then we acknowledge that we don't have enough medical masks for everybody in the country. So governors are saying, use a bandana, use a scarf, any sort of face covering when you go out in public. So now we get young Black men who many people in America already think are problematic, and now you're masking them. And we've seen over and over again that there were people in America who were afraid when young Black men with masks come into the businesses. And now we're dealing with the police and other things like that. So the intersectionality between the policing and the criminal justice part and the healthcare part met and was dropped right on my lap every time I get a call about the situation. And that's something that I absolutely did not predict.
Vilna?
Well, excuse me. So when COVID hit, the university where I teach is on a quarter system, and we were in the middle of, towards the end of a term that we could not complete face-to-face. And we were called to both protect students and their well-being and keep a university running. And what that meant is we had to jump right in as professors, and many of whom had no training to put courses online, had not the technical experience to do so, had never taught online before, but we had to do it. And I think for me personally, you asked about professional and personal, I did not, I wasn't prepared for the amount of stress that it would take to care for all these people and at the same time try to get your work done and at the same time take over for school districts that could no longer function. So you become a homeschooling parent immediately, and all of the personal and professional slammed into one another very quickly, and stress and illness really took over for me. I managed to close that quarter and start a new one, and at the same time there was a strike of graduate students at the UC system. So in supporting a strike where grad students were not predisposed to helping because they were fighting for a living wage. All of this came at the same time. It was a real wake-up call for me to understand how revolutionary self-care can be for Black women who are always, it's so difficult to know when you have to stop throwing yourself into giving, because it's not a natural thing for us to say, we need to give to ourselves now. So that was a really hard lesson, but learning to manage all that, which is still a challenge, and also continuing to devote myself to teaching undergrads about race and racism. It was really important to me. In fact, it was suggested by medical professionals that I should take leave, and I just felt that I could not do a medical leave and leave my students adrift at times like this.
Thank you. Courtney, how are you doing?
I'll say as an educator, I think, Vilna, a lot of what you're talking about really resonated for me. At Cal, we're on the semester system. We're the only school in the UC system that's on semesters. So, it was about 8 to 9 weeks of really just plowing through and radically recalibrating our teaching strategy to accommodate the needs of our students, many of whom suddenly found themselves unemployed, struggling with housing, dealing with family members who were immunocompromised or elderly or otherwise in need of financial support. And so, it kind of felt like as professors, we really had to switch from just sort of focusing on our responsibilities teaching in the classroom to providing, a variety of forms of triage, right? Emotional triage, financial triage, running our own support funds and mutual aid networks to support graduate students and undergraduate students. It was really a lot. So, all of that was true, here in the Bay Area as well. So I won't repeat the things that Vilna said, which, I think reflect the experiences of a lot of us working in public institutions of higher education. But I do think that the pandemic and the subsequent kind of, this sort of new wave of racial justice uprisings, a lot of people I know have referred to this moment as a kind of apocalyptic moment. And it does feel disastrous. In English, we tend to use the word apocalypse to refer specifically to the idea of disasters of various kinds. But, I was listening to a talk that a friend was giving a few weeks ago and actually learned that the word apocalypse is a Greek word that in its original origin refers to the idea of an unveiling or a revelation. And I think that what we're seeing right now is that, we are in a moment of apocalypse, right? Where a lot of sort of the lies that we have been told about how our systems operate, about the sort of the nature, the sort of structural stability of our democracy, of our economy, of our healthcare system, of our education systems, of our policing and our criminal justice systems, that they are not sound. And there are some of us who have never had the luxury of assuming that those systems work because we've been on the receiving end of knowing, of being brutalized by those systems, being excluded by those systems. But I think we're in a moment now where everyone has to reckon with the fact that the system doesn't work. And if we're going to survive this crisis, whether we're referring specifically to the coronavirus pandemic that we're all struggling to survive, or if we're going to survive the economic crisis that the pandemic has produced, or if we're going to survive the crisis that this new wave of uprisings, which are very needed, have produced, we're all going to have to come to terms with this unveiling of reality and accept the truth of what this country actually is so that we can begin to imagine a different kind of future together. So for me, that's what I feel like I've been thinking a lot about in this moment is what does it mean to take this idea of an apocalypse seriously and not to use that as an excuse to retreat into despair, but to take the opportunity to say, well, let's just deal with the truth of what this democratic experiment actually is, and move forward from there.
And I appreciate both you, Courtney, and Lorenzo, how you are sort of playing around with this metaphor of masking and unmasking, right? Because there's certain things about the COVID pandemic that really help to reveal what you're talking about, Courtney, this unveiling of, wow, the deeply entrenched systemic impacts, right? The systemic racism, the institutional inequities that exist, because then what do we see? We saw it in the health disparities, right? And all of the data that began to come out in terms of Black and Brown people and their exposure to COVID and what that's meant for our, even for our local and community economies, right? And how it's impacted us. And so that there's this interesting thing that's happening, that even with us literally masking ourselves, there's an unveiling of so many different kinds of issues, right? And then on top of that, the fact that, oh, something is happening with my thing, which is really weird. I'm so sorry for folks who are watching and listening. I'm simultaneously trying to do some stuff right here, right now, interrupting. But what I'll try to do is kind of usher us through this next section, because it got me thinking about what COVID has revealed to us, and the fact that we're all home, stunted in our homes, and how we have no opportunity other than to be on our phones and to be wired to the television, exposed in ways that we haven't been exposed to some of these inequities. And so why do you think there are some people who continue to struggle to understand the value and the significance of this outrage, right? So I'll give you a bunch of different kinds of frameworks that I've heard within the last week alone. I've heard one framework or narrative around the fact that, well, this is a good cop versus bad cop situation, as opposed to looking at this as an incident related to systemic racism. I've heard on certain news outlets that the kind of protests that we're seeing are being framed as being tribal affinity efforts, and that these kinds of tribal affinities deters making America great again, right? We've also seen the sort of juxtaposed or contrasting ways in which media representation has shown the protesting, right? As protests, as peaceful uprisings versus riots and looting, and that how there are agent provocateurs that are present, right? Along with the violence that we're seeing in some instances. And then finally, there's also this framework or this language around that, people have a lot of questions, and there's a hyper focus on the victims, mental and physical health, whether they have a past criminal history, like all of these different kinds of elements. So again, with those very competing and intersecting frameworks that exist, why is it that people still struggle as to, why people are marching in the streets, and why people are so angry, and that why, people are burning cars and shouting in the streets and are impassioned?
Let me say that I'd like to frame this a little differently. And again, as an urban sociologist, I like to put things in contextual frameworks. And when I talk about the Black community, and I talk about how we move forward, I try to explain to people that many folks in the Black community are experiencing vicarious trauma. And every time we turn on the TV, or every time we go to social media, we see Black pain over and over and over again. And unfortunately, we like to film that and re-show it just to show people this is what's going on. And with every death, the Black community, particularly every death that's televised or filmed and broadcast, we go through a grieving process. And I don't have to talk about the 5 stages of grief, but we start off with a level of denial in the Black community. No, this didn't happen again. And then they move into anger and get really upset. And then we go into the phase of when white America says, well, what's next? Then we move into the bargaining phase of the whole grief process. But the unfortunate part is that this death keeps happening over and over again, and we don't get to fully go through each stage of death, and we're knocked back again into the, oh no, not again. And we're in a perpetual stage of anger in the Black community about every death. So explaining to people what's going on, I think the paradigm that most people will actually get is the stages of grief. And then when people ask me, and it's been asked 50 times, in the last week of me, if it's been asked once. Why now? What makes George Floyd different? And I retort, if you think this is about George Floyd, you're not paying attention, because it's not just George Floyd. It's not just Breonna Taylor. It's not just Ahmaud Arbery. It's not just Eric Garner. And I keep going back, and I said, how far do I need to go back? Because the negative relationship between the police and people of color, this is not a new thing. And I'm not talking about the marches that my parents did in the 60s. I'm saying that we're going all the way back to slave patrols, when that's the very formation of policing. So if we understand how that part works, and understand that when the people were marching in the 60s, it's their kids or their grandkids that are now protesting now. So it's not that this is some historic view that we heard about or we read about, but our people are telling us, because our history is a verbal history, and we tell what's going on, and we pass this pain along, because there's not a place in American history for us to kind of solve the pain that we're going through. And being Black in America is in a constant state of pain and fear. And the last point, and I apologize because I've learned to talk in sound bites, but so I spent time in uniform, and the thing that hurt my heart, a couple of days ago, my older daughter, Lakiva, posted something on social media that literally brought tears to my eyes. She said when she was a little kid and her dad used to put on the uniform and put on the badge and go to work every day, she was afraid because dad was the good guy, and she was really afraid of what the bad guys were going to do. Now that she's an adult and has her own family, she's afraid every time her husband goes out, because now the shift is that I don't necessarily think the police are the good guys anymore. Many of them are the bad guys. So now I fear for my husband because of the police. And I think that's what's going on in a lot of situations, because the officer-friendly mentality, we don't get to see that a whole lot. In talking to a group in New York with Mayor de Blasio's people, I said, you know, there's a lot of good cops out there. There's a lot of really good people. But then the question is, if we have all these good cops, where are they when bad cops are doing bad stuff? And if they're standing by watching, doesn't that make them bad as well? Because silence looks like complicity.
Right. And not to jump in, but I mean, even in George Floyd's case, I mean, you still have these 3 outstanding cops that have been, you know, yeah, they were fired, but were there any charges up until just recently that they're talking about pressing? I mean, almost a whole week has passed, right? And or even in that moment when it's just like, you know, my fellow brother in blue, I don't think we were taught to put our knee on the neck like that. You know, hey, you know, like at what point is it at like the 5-minute mark that one of them says, okay, I think he's not moving now. I think he's not resisting, air quotes, right? Or whatever the explanation would be. I think it's okay. You know, what happens at minute 7? At minute 7 and 50 seconds? I mean, at minute 8, at what point, right? And so it just makes it a challenging part where it's just like, people have a lot of questions and have a lot of anger and don't understand, if it's a brotherhood, why can't enough of those good cops show up and intervene in situations like that?
So let's take a look at the officer, and you may note that I choose not to say his name. I'll say George Floyd's name all day long, but the officer, I'm not saying his name. But if you notice the cavalier attitude, the smug look in his face, the fact that he kneeled there with his hands in his pockets, knowing he's being filmed, knowing multiple people from multiple angles were filming him and complaining, he had absolutely no worry that he was going to be brought to justice. He didn't think he was going to get in trouble. He didn't think certainly he would get fired or he would get charged. Because in America, we don't have a history of holding police accountable. We give the police the benefit of the doubt far too often. I may or may not have had the benefit of the doubt at some point in my life, which is why I can talk about this. And that's problematic. Until we get to hold the police accountable, and I don't think we should hold them accountable the same way we hold the rest of the community accountable. That's not what I'm asking for, because the police have a higher calling. The police have more power, they have more authority. They should be held to a higher standard, because to whom much is given, much is required.
And I know that for you, Lorenzo, you have about 3 more minutes left before you got to go back to Fox 61. So not to jump around in the conversation, but you brought it yourself. Well, then what then does accountability look like then if you're even saying the police and the police departments nationally have a very particular responsibility? You know, what does that really look like? And then what does that then look like for um, brown and black people in these communities where they're being overly policed? And what's the kind of paradigmic shift do you see happening then in this world of accountability?
I think a lot of the shift comes from the inside, and there are certain organizations, and full disclosure, I'm a life member of NOBLE, the National Association of Black Law Enforcement Executives. And a week ago Saturday, I was on a call with a bunch of NOBLE executives, and to hear the pain in these people's voices, because they say, oh yeah, I'm a police chief, or I'm a police commander, but I'm black all the time. And to hear the pain in the voice, and NOBLE stands as the social conscience of policing. So NOBLE is driving a lot of the change. And if you notice, since 2016, there's been an onslaught of black and black females becoming police chiefs across the country. So we need to help change this from the inside. Unfortunately, police unions, I think, are hugely problematic. Saying that, acknowledging that I wasn't official in a union for a bunch of my time in uniform, I also think that's a problem because they tend to protect each other. The Fraternal Order of Police, I don't know that I will never give another dime to that organization, because a lot of the organizations are just protecting cops at all costs, good cops or bad cops. And I've been in trainings, and Ben Crump and I highlighted a training that we did in Florida a year ago, and the attorney for the FOP went before us. And so the FOP was first, I was second, and Ben Crump was third. So that was an interesting place for me to sit in. It was a really cool space. And the FOP attorney said, no matter what happens, when the rubber hits the road, when something hits the fan, you have to tell them that you feared for your life. And that's the reason that you used force. And I had a visceral reaction to that. And I stood up and apologized, and I asked the guy to stand up because he was sitting in the back room. I said, stand up. And I said, everybody take a look at this guy. This is the guy that gets you fired. This is the guy that gets you put into prison. This is the guy that makes you lose your house. Don't listen to that garbage. That's wrong. And if we can get the police to police with compassion, and I'm trying to convince people all the time that people in the community aren't your enemies. And for far too long, we police from the perspective of the police officer. They get to determine when protest starts. They get to determine when a protest ends. They get to determine which roadway you get to use. So if I may use the metaphor, the history of the jungle is written from the perspective of the hunter. The lion doesn't get to tell his story because many times he's captured or killed. What would happen if we started studying policing from the perspective of the community? Ask community members how they want to be policed, and I think we're going to see a change.
Okay, and so before you go, I wanted to ask you if there are particular actions that our listeners and our viewers, if there are particular recommendations that you would like to provide from your perspective and from the space that you operate in, because you are a consultant and you actually go to various police departments across the nation to talk about race and equity and how they can improve their own community policing approach. But are there particular things that for folks who are at home listening, like, all right, well, what do I do then? How do I engage this as an individual, as my, neighborhood block? Do you have any thoughts, comments?
Yes, several things. One, some of these are going to seem really, really simplistic, but one, fill out the census. We need to be counted because representation is based on who we are and where we are. Two, vote in local elections, regardless of who you think the president is or how you feel about that, but it's the city council who hires the police chief. And it's the local elections that get your state's attorneys or district attorneys involved. We need to have our voices heard. And then whenever I talk to community members, I always ask them, how many of you have ever gotten a jury duty notice? And everybody has raised their hand, everyone that's an adult. And then I ask, How many of you have ever gotten out of jury duty? The folks are high-fiving and raising their hand like, oh, I've never gone. And that's part of the problem, because we don't serve on juries. So when these officers are now being held accountable, when they go to a trial, the people don't look like us because we're getting out of jury duty. So they get to have their people rule on them, the people that are okay with the police, the people that never have these negative relationships. So we need to be on jury so our voice can be heard there as well. Those are some easy steps.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Lorenzo Boyd. We appreciate the time that you've taken out for us today. Enjoy your coverage during Fox 61 News in Connecticut.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate it. And I really applaud all that you're doing, and you're doing an amazing job. Ladies, I am going to listen to the podcast because I want to hear your stories. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So Vilna and Courtney, thank you still for hanging strong. So I posed the question again. I presented several different frameworks in which people are operating from. And, you know, that comes up when I see that, wow, people are really failing or struggling to understand and value the significance of the outrage that we're seeing in the streets. What are your thoughts?
Well, what I want to say is I believe that this pain and anger have always been there, but I also want to make the point that the hate and has always been there too. I think I remember and still do so many of the people in my discipline, which is sociology, had been writing about the post-racial moments during the Obama years. And when my book, The Ethnic Project, came out, which discusses the relationship between race and ethnicity and how we understand difference and always have in this country as racial hierarchy. I am an optimist, but it has a pessimistic view, because if you look at the historical record, we have never really dealt with this idea that our country has been built on an understanding that some human beings have more value than others. And we do a little 3-card Monte of like switching around who those people are and leaving Black people at the bottom of the hierarchy at all times. What I'm trying to say is I could see when that book first came out that people would ask me, do you really think we're not making progress, or do you really think it's that bad? And I said, I would love to have proof that we are going to a better place, but I just don't see that. And now, I mean, I don't want to say I'm vindicated. I'm actually heartbroken to have been right, that we have not dealt with the hate, that we made a fatal mistake by thinking these are the ideas of only those people who wear hoods at night. There are so many people complicit with this and maybe don't even know it, because our education systems, our communities are structured in ways that make it easy for white people to never see this, never have had to deal with it in any way, shape, or form. So I really want to also say that what I think is happening is the visual is really making a difference. This is what happened in the Vietnam War years, when journalists were reporting what was actually happening on the ground. People got out in the streets, also because their family members were at risk. And now we are seeing, the Black community has said for years, this racial inequality is killing us. Police brutality is killing us. And when others are out in the streets and seeing that their lives are not as valuable to the authorities as they thought they were, and you have visual evidence of that truth, I think we'll find people less and less surprised at the outrage because they really thought this was about somebody else and this was about if you had only complied, and they really now understand it wasn't about compliance, it was about what kind of country do we want to live in, and we get to decide that if we participate, as Lorenzo said, by voting, by census, by serving on juries, but also by making your opinion known, by being out on the street, by contributing. This was your other question, but contribute to bail funds, by giving to food pantries, by understanding how inequality works and talking to your family members and community members about it and working with them to make real systematic change.
Mm-hmm. Courtney?
That's a tough act to follow, Vilna. I feel like you covered a lot of the things that I would argue. I mean, I think that, part of these narratives that people like to tell themselves about, oh, it's not the police it's not that the police are all bad, it's just a few bad apples. The idea that somehow if we can all just put aside our racial and ethnic differences and focus on restoring America to some imagined glorious past, that everyone will benefit from this. The kinds of narratives that I think, the kinds of sort of self-indulgent narratives that I think that particularly middle-class white people like to engage in, they're comforting in a way. I think a lot about the work of James Baldwin and how he talks about how Americans really can't handle too much of the truth, right? That white Americans are socialized to be blind to the levels of structural violence that are required to maintain the comfortable lives that they enjoy. They have to ignore the fact that they're able to have access to mortgages and dignified housing because a whole lot of middle class and working class Black and brown people are given bad mortgages or subprime mortgages.
Right.
They are blind to the fact that they live in nice neighborhoods where their children go to good schools because Black and brown people are redlined into communities where they don't own property and their kids go to poorly funded schools. They're oblivious to the fact that they enjoy high levels of access to high quality health care because they have access to the types of employment that provide that. And the vast majority of Black and brown people don't have access to the forms of employment that give you access to high quality health care. So much of whiteness, I think, or so much of normative whiteness is structured around a kind of willful and studied blindness that being exposed to the truth of how one's privilege is created and maintained structurally is a really tough pill to swallow, right? And so it's easier to say that there are just a handful of bad police officers than it is to say that the police exist to protect the property and lives and livelihoods of white people. And that historically that has been its function. And I think that particularly in this sort of, to go back to this idea of like, when Obama was elected and, this idea of America entering a kind of post-racial moment, which really did it became its own sort of zeitgeist in that moment. But and people were really happy to invest in this idea. And I was like, there are still 2 million Black people in prison. Like, there might be a Black man in the White House, but there are still 2 million Black people in prison. But this idea that we were living in a post-racial America, that idea gave people a lot of comfort because then it meant that they didn't have to do any of that structural work, that by being individual good people, by voting the right way, by buying fair trade, by just, engaging in these acts of sort of like consumer-based progressivism, they could imagine themselves as having, overcome racism. And it's not, racism is a structural problem that's not going to be remedied through a handful of individual actions, but has to be enacted through a complete rethinking of the structures and institutions that govern our lives. And that's a much harder political undertaking, and that's like work that's going to take generations to do. And so I think like that sort of retreat from a structural analysis into an individual one is part of the narrative that white people tell themselves so that they don't have to deal with the reality of the world that they've created. And I get it, because it is really painful to confront that, and the truth of the matter is that most of the education that, as a university professor, when I'm dealing with young white people, and I'm sure Vilna would agree, I cannot tell you the number of times I get to the end of the semester and you have young white people come into your office in your office hours who are just like, I had no idea.
That's right.
I had no idea. And it is a very heartbreaking moment. Like, I can understand a lot of Black people who are just like, I ain't got time for that. But, but as an educator, I'm like, oh, I think that's actually true. I think there's actually nothing in your experience that has prepared you to deal with the totality of how white supremacy as a structural process operates. And it is deeply painful to come to terms with the ways in which you have been inadvertently, unknowingly, blindly privileged by that system in ways that you probably would not have chosen had you been aware of that, right? And then to think about what is the work that is required to become part of a sort of broader project to dismantle that can be overwhelming. It's similar to the way that we talk about climate change. Like, where does one begin? And so I think that, again, like, part of the comfort of those narratives is that it shifts focus away from the structural dimensions of the problem in a way that is sort of easier and more digestible for people to manage, but ultimately is a delusion, because we're not going to individually act our way out of this. We have to come together and engage in these forms of collective action that are really targeted at transforming the structural conditions of our society. And that's much harder work to do.
No, I've enjoyed both of your comments, Vilna and Courtney, because it's like the same side of the coin, and right. And it's just like, the different part of that same face that's confronting us, right? This notion of just, people kind of thought this whole post-racialism and Obama's presidency was the fix all, and just a demonstration of, wow, see, the sort of prophetic elements of MLK's speech, like, we're here, we've arrived, right? In the middle of, even during his own presidency, we had Trayvon Martin, right? And to me, I think it's sort of interesting around just the George Floyd is no different in terms of the details around compared to Eric Garner or others that have been captured on tape. And we've seen their brutalization, and we've seen, close to their death and what have you, just being documented. But there's something about this very interesting moment in time that's causing people to question the cultural models that are in their heads around this notion of, well, what does it mean to be a non-Black person? Or what does it mean to be in the space of operating within normative white structures and normative whiteness, and the privilege that comes along with that, and the cultural models around, United States is built on meritocracy, which is very much on individualism. And so everyone wants to have their own individual solution to whatever problem that they see, right? So it's like, oh no, George Floyd, he wasn't murdered by the police officer. He had other kinds of issues. There was this present in his blood system, or he had hypertension, just to kind of excuse other things. To your point, Courtney, it's like, if we step away, just the fact that the engagement between himself and the officer even occurred speaks to not just individual actions, but just more of a systemic problem in terms of how the police are trained to engage communities and engage communities of color. And what systems are in place when officers are struggling with their own biases, their own prejudices, and their own mental health. I mean, because as an aside, I think, violence is something that's about power, but also I think the murder of someone is quite intimate. Like, I'm sure he felt under his knee sort of just this person transitioning, right? That's so intimate. And that something here doesn't click for you to be like, wow, there's a life that's being lost right now, and I'm physically connected to, like, my knee is on their person, right? So it's troubling to me, and it seems hard when I think about people who are stepping up as allies to say, well, what to do, how can I overcome this? And I think for us in our community, we contend with our spirituality in the face of this perpetual injustice. Right. We'll say, won't he do it? But it's like, that he's tried his best, but what are we doing about it? Right. Particularly when we have some true sentiments around feeling hopelessness and that this is just more of the same.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I grew up in a pretty religious family, but, I've always been of the mindset that God helps those who help themselves. So, I'm like, it's, we can't just sort of like turn it over to Jesus and hope they go, he's going to work it out. There's some work that I think we have to do on our own. But, I think part of what's really important for people to understand about these uprisings, and again, like this moment that we're in right now, as Vilna was pointing out earlier, is like, it's just the most recent iteration of a much longer historical struggle, which is not about, like, I think on a certain level, there's an idea that this is just about like civil rights or, we want to be treated the same way as white people. But I think the struggle is actually much deeper than that. I think the struggle is really about shifting paradigms in the culture so that it is possible for non-Black people to recognize the personhood and the humanity of Black people. The truth is that I don't know that officer felt like there was a person underneath him when he had his knee on his neck. Because what I saw was someone who was completely, I mean, if you've ever, for people, I would encourage listeners, you can go online and do a cursory search for lynching photographs. And I don't typically tell people to look at these sort of gratuitous images of violence against Black people, but I find lynching photographs really interesting, not because of the display of these sort of mutilated and, degraded Black bodies that are represented in those images, but look at the white people in those images.
Right.
And there's like and when you look at those images, the look, part of what was so chilling, I think, about looking at this video killing of George Floyd, is that the image of the sort of the expression on the officer's face was identical to the kind of blank expression that you see on the faces of white people who are attending these lynchings, which were mass public gatherings. People would come out, they were like celebrations. People would come out, they'd bring their children, they were family affairs, people would take photographs. I mean, these were public spectacles that white people participated in. And part of what was happening was that it was a collective sort of moment in which, the violence that was being enacted against this Black person, whoever that person may have been in the specific incident, they were not human in that moment, And so I think that this is something, like, part of what's happening in these protests and in this uprising is Black people saying, we are tired of having to try to figure out all of these different ways to articulate our personhood to the general public. We are tired of having to, justify our humanity to the broader public. We are tired of being told that we don't have a right to defend our personhood, right? So if so there's only two options. You can get killed by a police officer, or you get arrested for resisting that police officer who tries to kill you. Those are your options. But the idea that you are a human being and that you have a right to basic recognition of your personhood is never something that Black people have enjoyed in this country. Ever.
Vilna?
I want to add that I think you said this beautifully. And I just going back to the idea of understanding the relationship between Black people and the United States of America. I actually, I don't have a spiritual practice. I was raised in a religious family, but my frustration with both kind of waiting for a savior and seeing so much injustice in the world makes me, have my version of, God helps those who help themselves. If there's a God listening, why aren't you doing anything? So let me not even worry about if somebody's listening. I've got to do my part, and I encourage people to do their part. And so I think the way I read the historical record, I actually see African Americans as some of the most hopeful people who have ever existed on this planet. We have put ourselves on the line for this country, from the American Revolution to what we see happening on the streets today. And there has been no time when we haven't been at the center of everything that is glorious in this country. Everything. So I actually think, yes, we flag, and yes, we are tired, and yes, we have PTSD, but we are always struggling for a better way. I think one of the things that really makes this moment important, though, is COVID. And the fact that, as you said, we have this perpetual mentality of individualism and meritocracy. And people have seen that hard work that got you that great job and that great health care does not help save you if this nation is structured in a way where you cannot get the attention that you need, the resources that you need. In the richest country in the world, we don't have enough ventilators to save people's lives. We don't have enough masks to get you to the grocery store. I mean, when you see that kind of inequity enacted on people, a matter of life and death, and then you have filming of these refrigerated trucks taking bodies out of our major cities, and you see Black men, women, and children being shot and killed and strangled. We have 43 million people who filed for unemployment. That doesn't include people who didn't file for unemployment. It doesn't include the numbers of hungry people we had before the economy started to crash and burn. We're in trouble, and I think people have finally seen that it ain't just Black folks. Right. It ain't just us. And we have always said, you know, you take care of the Black people, the underserved, the people who are in the worst position in this nation, and you will take care of all of us. And I hope people are finally getting that message, because that is loud and clear.
Mm-hmm. And I hope that they are listening and, you know, watching and trying to be engaged in ways that, you know, maybe they weren't fully aware of or just didn't know how they could be engaged. But I hope that this is not only a moment for people to stop, watch, listen, but then for them to feel empowered to then do and to be called to action to really bring about the change that our communities in particular have been talking about since slavery, right? Mm-hmm. Since Black codes, since Jim Crow, since civil rights, 1960s, that people like to hearken to say, there was so much legislation that happened. And it's like, no, but we're still having these dire problems where we're being systematically denigrated and killed and murdered and incarcerated in such high numbers. And guess what? And the world is watching. I mean, as a sidebar, you know, to me, it's incredible to hear how, you know, our white-skinned people of color in places like the Middle East, people in Europe, in Germany, in France, in different places, even down through the Caribbean and Central and South America, they are protesting. You know, even China's looking to the United States like, oh, y'all have a lot to say about, you know, human rights violations. But these are crimes against humanity that the United States have complicitly participated in, right? So I say all of that where it's just like, you know, you had people like the national co-chair of the Women's March, Tamika Mallory, right? Where she's imploring those in power and position to really, truly address the systemic injustices, right? And, you know, and also to encourage people, can you stop white-splaining effective methods of social protests, right? That's just another kind of sidebar way in which, you know, folks feel that they're welcome to police the ways in which we're able to cry out injustice. They're like, well, no, don't do that, right? So she's like, can you stop that too? But her famous line that I'm sure you've seen, both of you've seen, where she says, America has looted Black people. America's looted Native Americans when they first came here. Looting is what you do. If you want us to do better, then damn it, you do better too, right? So in this notion around, we're in COVID. COVID revealed so much about inequity and inequality that exists. Everyone, even our local governors, are like, well, it's going to be back to a new normal, right? But then what does that really mean, even for specifically African descendants, right? Like, what does that new normal mean when it comes to us having experiences of full dignity and respect that we deserve? And how can we even get there in this new normal that everyone keeps talking about, right? Or should we even desire to get there? Is the new normal really something different that none of us have been really, conceptually thought about? Yeah, I know that sounded like a...
No,
Please solve the problem,
I
Courtney.
understand it.
Please let us all know.
No, I mean, I understand it. And I did see that speech by Tamika Mallory. And, part of what I really appreciated about it was that, to your earlier question about spirituality, I do think, I do have a spiritual practice, which I've talked about on this program, actually. But, I do think one of the things for me that's been so energizing about this particular uprising is that there is a feeling of really profound ancestral rage that pervades this moment, right? Where people are very clearly connecting these contemporary forms of social and structural inequality that we live under to longer standing historical patterns of inequality, and making the argument that, look, what we're fighting against, this is not something, we're not like making these protests in a vacuum, but we're speaking to a continuum of historic violence that has to be named and that has to be addressed, and that we have to speak to now because it has never been addressed in a way that has been substantive or meaningful, right? And legislation alone is not going to do the trick. Apologies are not going to do the trick. Monetary restitution in the form of court settlements and all of that is not going to do the trick, right? What we want is radical structural reform, which is what we've been asking for all along. And so, there is something about this moment that feels like, when she made this argument about looting, it was a really important intervention in this kind of broader discourse of, okay, we're just going to ignore all the legitimate political demands that people in the streets are making and focus on the people who decided that they'd rather take this as an opportunity to clean out Gucci or, roll up on different stores and, and wipe them out. And, you can have whatever feelings you have or, about people who are engaged in those forms of looting and what their actual relationship is to the movement. How many of those people are people who just kind of showed up and are doing their own thing, right? And are just kind of taking this as a moment to kind of piggyback on the political demands that Black activists are making. But it is striking in this country how quick the state is to move to protect property in a way that it never, ever, ever moves to protect life and like the bodies of Black people. A burned down CVS is unfortunate. Freddie Gray and Mike Brown and Sandra Bland and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, those are tragedies.
Right.
And the fact that people seem to have a problem noting the difference is an issue. And even if we were going to take seriously the claim that property is sacrosanct, which I don't believe, by the way, like I really don't care about the value of property because property is a replaceable good. Even if we were to buy that argument is really rich, coming from people living in a stolen country, built on stolen land by stolen labor. Hard to take that argument seriously, right? So let's just call this thing out for what it is. Again, the moment of unveiling and reckoning, right? Be real about what this democracy, which is a very fragile political project, be real about what it's actually premised on. It's not a democratic order that has ever been fully inclusive from its inception. It was a democracy designed for propertied white men. And Black people and brown people and Native people have been central and expanding the boundaries of that democratic order to make it more inclusive and to make it live up to its meaning and to its potential and its promise. And white people have fought us every step of the way.
Right.
Right. But now they're finding, Vilna, your point earlier was really important. Now they're finding that when you refuse to let other people in, when you refuse to attend to the flaws in your political order, it actually makes you more vulnerable in ways that you can't see when you're sitting in the center. But the view from the margins is really clear.
Right, right. And that's so on point, Courtney, because when I think about the different types of like really large companies worldwide that also, no surprise, have been able to have major economic gains because of the purchase power from Black and Brown communities. But what, what's interesting in even their framing and their role in it is that a lot of them, for the most part, are articulating very clearly and taking a stance to say, look, we can't focus on our own D&I sort of issues internal to our organizations, right? We can't only just focus on what it is for our Black and Brown employees without really attending to what this means for Black and Brown people writ large. We can't talk about, educating the youth through our corporate sponsored programs if we're not talking about the well-being, mental health, physical, economic well-being of Black and Brown youth in the same communities that purchase our sneakers, that purchase our foods and our ice cream and all that sort of thing. And it's interesting because most of these conglomerates kind of sit at the center of, if we're talking about, particular businesses and retail, now really taking a more of an eagle's eye view to say, holy smokes, right? Like, this is major. And it's important for us to take a stance because something about the previous climate didn't really allow us to be entrenched in this particular way. And now we have to reckon with this because, as you're saying, this is a reckoning that's occurring, and it's forcing folks to really be accountable in ways, or at least companies being accountable in ways that we haven't really seen in such a long time. Vilna?
Yeah, I think maybe ever. I have been so tired of the diversity discourse that argues some form of, I always get this vision of white people in a room wondering why there's no brown people in the room and talking to each other about how do we get one in here. And like that doesn't even scratch the surface of the fundamental problems that got you all around the table and excluded other voices. So I really think that this moment of reckoning is really about seeing diversity as problematic and equity as something we really need to go for. This whole idea of equal opportunity is based on this individualistic meritocratic model. And we need to talk about equality of outcomes. Like, why the fuck are we still having massive unequal death? Why are our resources for the next generation based on property taxes? And nothing else in our economy is funded that way. This is insanity. So I really think that instead of looking around to wonder why you're seeing segregated communities and boardrooms and classrooms and conference rooms, let's start talking about completely restructuring our society so we don't have that question. We need not have that question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So for both of you, well then what should accountability look like, right? So before Lorenzo departed us, he was talking from his standpoint, and I think that's intermixed in his consultancy work when he's physically going to these different police departments across the nation and engaging in training with them around more effective ways of how does one police, or how do departments police in particular communities? But how do we then say hold our allies accountable, and how should we support them in their efforts? Or even for our Black and brown, and as I like to call them, our lighter skinned, white skinned people of color who are living abroad, right? Who are watching us. And, you know, sometimes they participate in this weird sort of cultural ideal about, well, what does America represent when I come here, and then what America represents when I'm at home abroad, and how can I show my allegiance to my brown and Black brothers and sisters? Like, where does accountability lie with these folks, and how do you think we can maybe start with them?
Well, you know, I think it's a challenging question, but I think
Leave it to me, Courtney.
all the big questions.
All the big questions.
And it's like we're not doing no fluff. But you know, I think, you know, I guess one way I like to think about it is kind of like putting it into different sort of temporal frames, because there's a sort of variety you have to think about the struggle in sort of multiple sort of period. You know, you want to like period, you have to think about it like, what are short-term goals, what are like immediate goals, what are medium-term goals, what are long-term goals, right? There are very practical, pragmatic short-term goals that one can set that, you know, are about, you know, I think in this moment right now, you know, I think supporting, you know, like you know, like Vilna was talking about earlier, I mean, I think right now supporting this uprising and working to shift the kind of popular discourse about this uprising, and supporting people who have a very clear political agenda, whether it's something like defund the police, whether it's, you know, talking about making demands on the importance of improving relationships between police departments and communities, instituting forms of community oversight and accountability for police departments so that they at least have to talk to us and answer to us when these things happen, instead of hiding behind a wall of police unions and administrative bullshit. I think, you know, supporting local grassroots activist efforts, giving money to bail funds and getting the people out of jail. It's very dangerous for activists to be in jail right now. We know, because of the way that COVID-19 has spread, that jails and prisons are vectors of disease and transmission. And so it is imperative that people not sit in those spaces for long periods of time, because it increases their likelihood of getting sick after they've already been exposed to things like tear gas, which is weakening their respiratory systems. So supporting bail funds, supporting legal defense funds, supporting organizations like here in the Bay Area, we have you know, the Anti-Police Terror Project. There are a number of organizations that are connected to the movement for Black Lives throughout the country that are, you know, that are fighting against police brutality and state violence all over the country. We can, of course, support the families of people who have been victims of state violence, absolutely, because they need that support. So those are kind of immediate short-term goals that I think that we can support. Also supporting things like, you know, I do think voting is important. Voting by itself is not going to get us free. And I totally get people who have frustrations with the, you know, the short-sightedness of the Democratic Party. But, you know, I have a really good friend who said something that I thought was really true, where she said, you know, voting is not about voting for who you like. It's not a popularity contest. You vote for someone who you think you can out-organize. And I think right now we're in a position where we have not been able to out-organize Donald Trump because he does not have a moral conscience. He's not moved by the kinds of forms of public shaming, you know, that ordinarily can create a kind of meaningful political response from the state, right? So we got to get him out and get somebody in there that we can organize, that we can out-organize, you know? And I like my odds of out-organizing Joe Biden a lot better than I like my odds of out-organizing Donald Trump. So those are longer-term political goals. I think, you know, in terms of engaging and supporting projects like Critical Resistance that are committed to prison reform and prison abolition, you know, and then thinking longer term in terms of what does widespread structural transformation look like? Because these are political projects that are going to outlive all of us, unfortunately. You know, like our children will be fighting those battles, but we can help make their struggles a little bit easier by doing our part now and thinking like ancestors, rather than assuming that we're going to transform everything in our lifetime. That's not going to happen. But what you can do is lay the groundwork and provide people with the tools to continue the work when you're no longer here to do the work with them. You know, so I think that our political vision in that sense absolutely should be rooted in a kind of logic of like, if I think like an ancestor, what would I tell my descendants to do?
Mm.
was
I love
beautiful.
your ancestral veneration that you have inserted, because I think in many ways when you think about social movements and Black social movements too, you know, I think a lot of what we see with the Black Lives Matter in terms of how they've been trying to mobilize, even in a different realm, they're trying to borrow from, you know, generations before around, well, how do we get the word out? So we definitely see similarities that way. But they're also living in a different time and space where there's social media that didn't exist in the same way that it did, you know, just, you know, 60 years ago, right? And so we kind of see that. And then I also see the efforts are relatively decentralized. And so I think that's also another kind of, I wouldn't say problematic, but I think it's a factor that we must contend with when we're thinking about, well, how do we then move forward? Because it was easier to be like, all right, we had in the lineup MLK, and then Mahalia, she gonna sing something that's gonna like, right? And the movement had a really strong social, it had a program, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for our young people, at least this is my observation as a sociologist putting on that hat, it seems somewhat decentralized. So you're having these pockets of entities that are engaging and are, you know, we have these most mass mobilizations that we see like in front of us. But then I think even for some of the young people, they're like, I don't know what to do. So we've had a moment of silence. We had a die-in. We've held our fists up. We've chanted, you know, 5 or 6 different statements. And then what? And so I like what you're saying in terms of your framework, Courtney, around having a, you know, kind of short-term, immediate, medium, midterm, and then long-term, because it's really about how do we help inform and guide the current young people who are some of our children, right? And then the ones that come after them in terms of really laying down the groundwork as well. So no, I appreciate that. Vilna?
Yeah, I can't follow that. That was beautiful and so moving. And the only thing I would say is I would love to echo the part about organizing. I have been so fortunate this quarter that I have had many students in my course on critical race and racism come back to me and tell me how much they learned and how much that course has changed them. And, you know, that is the only reason I wanted to be a professor, that I want to connect with people and talk about ideas and leave this planet better than I found it. So that idea of thinking like an ancestor, I'm going to take that away from this conversation. Thank you for that. But I think there's a young man I taught many years ago who a white man said to me in class at the end of the semester, "This is the very first time I have ever felt comfortable talking about race." I mean, there's a person, it's one like you described before, Courtney, who would be on the verge of tears, not having had any education about how these systematic problems arise and perpetuate. And he concluded by saying, "And once your class is over, I'm never going to discuss this again." Because he never had ever experienced a place where he felt safe enough to ask questions, to be corrected, to engage with someone who didn't look like him. And then he knew that once he left my classroom, there was no space for him to do that. So I hope that at the end of all this, we have spaces and conversations for these young people who are just having their eyes open to the horrors that we all knew about. So, and that's what I wish to come out of all of this, that it's more than just, going home and, getting the pepper spray out of your eyes, or, scrolling through Twitter and seeing the horrors and wondering, and then like, how can we make change so that this is a thing in the history books and we could say, that's behind us and we have chosen a better way. That's what I hope comes out of this.
So I think for both of you, which I find quite interesting, is that both of you are artists, right? So, and what I've also been able to see and bear witness to is this nice pop-up of all kinds of art muralists that are engaged in, their own form of social protest, uprising, resistance by having these murals up. I've seen, people have taken pictures and sent them to me because they knew that I was recording this show. So they're like, check this out. This is what they're doing in Iran. This is what they're doing in Germany. This is what they're doing in all these different places across the world because people are watching, and how they're using their platform and their skill and their artistry to be engaged in bringing awareness and curating actual tangible space, or using tangible spaces to be able to express themselves. How is it that you see some of this work informing not just your scholarship, of course, but your artistry and the kind of visual productions that you are currently engaged in? Because there are different ways, I've been explaining to even my own children, there are different ways to engage in social protests that, when I think about the 75 or 80-year-old church mom, she may not, feel comfortable out in the streets with all of these young people, but she might be engaged in other kinds of ways to contribute, like the donating of funds, or cooking in the church, or donating foods to the food banks in other ways. But if you both can speak to your art and how you see this moment connected, I think that would be nice for the listeners.
Well, I can tell you that I've been working closely with the Colored Girls Museum in Philadelphia more recently. They're a really wonderful small organization devoted to shining a light on Black girls in the United States and globally. And so I have sent my work there, my paintings there for exhibitions, but also I'm now curating a part of an exhibition that's going to be in honor of Toni Morrison, about how Black women like us have gotten through these times. And again, I think the focus of that exhibition is really about making visible the lives of Black women and how we struggle and maintain our everyday dignities. And I think it's really important to have a venue like that that honors that humanity that people seem in this country to have such a hard time visualizing. I think, again, echoing the comments I made before, the visual really sends a different kind of message that gets to the heart of people rather quickly. I mean, in my profession, what's valued are articles that come out in journals that only other professors really get to read, unless we force our graduate students or undergrads to have to absorb that stuff. But journals are that's where conversations between professors happen. We have to have conversations with everyone else in order to make our knowledge and our research digestible and understood and translatable to other people. And I think art is a really important way of doing that. It's unfortunate that in the academy, interdisciplinarity is something they talk about all the time, but they don't actually let us do it very readily. So I think Courtney and I are both been struggling with that kind of thing for many years. And so I'm so glad you brought this up, but I'm also glad to have people like Courtney on the team where we are all working and learning from each other on how to get this kind of work done. So Courtney, please.
Yeah. It's funny because my preferred social media platform is the Gram. And someone had posted a short clip of a song called Freedom that was part of the film soundtrack for the film Black Panther that came out, I believe in 1995. And it's a song written by one of my favorite Black female singers named Joy Gilliam. And it's kind of like this super group, right? So like everybody's in this song. Like Queen Latifah's there, Mary J. Blige is there, Aaliyah's in it, like Salt and Pepper, like literally everybody is in this video. Like every Black woman that was making music in the mid-90s is in this video. And I love this song. And as I was scrolling through the comments, there was a young man who said something like, yeah, that's cute and all, but singing ain't gonna get it. Like singing's not gonna get us free. And I was just like, well, that's probably true. Singing by itself will probably not get us free. And I also know that every movement needs a soundtrack. And, I think like you can't make sense of political movements without, like, all political movements produce their own cultural aesthetics that accompany those movements that then become like the most sort of recognizable parts of those movements. Like, there are places in the country where people had no relationship or connection to the Black Panther Party, but readily recognized the iconography of the Black Panther Party and could express their solidarity and connection to the values of that organization and that movement, and like the idea of Black power by wearing symbols or, wearing their hair, like the body became its own sort of like place of practicing like a sort of aesthetic politics that mark you as someone who supports and understands the mission and the vision, like the goal of that political movement. So I think artists always really have an important role to play in, projects for social change. And, it may be true that like all the art that I make on a daily basis might not seem like overtly political in its orientation, but it's like, as a Black artist, you can't help but be political. I mean, you live in a world where you know that you are an object of systems of racism and sexism and like homophobia and class inequality. And so you have to, like, all of that informs the work in a particular kind of way. These days, I had started working on a project that was about sort of engaging with this Orisha, Yemaya, who's kind of like the Orisha of maternity. She is the Orisha who governs the top part of the ocean. And so I was just really interested in thinking about like motherhood and, Black body and all of that. And now, because of everything that's happening, I find myself watching these video clips of Black women who are mothers of people who have been killed by the police or have been killed by white vigilantes, and just thinking about like how Yemaya is sort of made manifest in the rage of someone like Leslie McSpadden, Michael Brown's mother, or like, in the grief of someone like Sabrina Fulton, Trayvon Martin's mother, or, like the other day, George Floyd's, the mother of his daughter, gave a press conference, and she just, like Yemaya is there in her tears, and so it's like, even these things that seem really like banal, like, oh, you talk about maternity and motherhood, and da, da, da. Even those things in this moment take on a sort of political valence that I think is important, so that's some of the stuff that I'm working on directly. And, I also had an opportunity, like literally just this week, I became part of a collective of Black women artists based in the San Francisco Bay Area called See Black Women. And there's a page on Instagram, and they've already started doing a lot of programming with the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco and the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. but we're going to be doing other kinds of programming connecting to Black women artists and Black queer artists who are working all over the country. So Vilna, like, we'll definitely have to talk about that.
Oh, please. I can't wait.
Yeah, you definitely want to get you up, get you involved in that. But like using this as an opportunity to build connection with other artists who are interested in talking about these issues and like talking about their creative practice, but also talking about the ways that they're trying to use their creative practice to amplify these broader social issues that they care about, because we need space for that. And they're all connected. So those are some of the things that I'm working on. But yeah, I see artists like in the Bay. You can't like shake a stick at a protest and not hit an artist. Like people are just deeply engaged in a way that I find really gratifying. And that is really challenging me to, again, not sort of say like my work has to look like this, but is about saying, that is about challenging myself to be like, okay, well, what kind of intervention can I make in this moment with my work? What kind of contribution can I make in this moment with my work that only I can make, with my art, and being really intentional about that.
So I know we're at time. We're probably a little bit over time. So I appreciate your patience and our listeners and viewers who are sticking to the end. But it would be remiss of me to close out without asking if there are any particular audience takeaways that you think may help inspire, inform, support folks on their journeys of belonging to Blackness during this time. I mean, these could be anything around the ethics of care and healing, any potential resources for mobilization. I know before Lorenzo hopped off, he was giving a call to action around people being engaged in terms of voting and other kinds of ways of civic participation. But do you each have anything else to add that can really help support folks during this time?
It's really hard. I will also say, similar to Courtney's idea of looking short-term, medium-term, and long-term, we could also look, hyper-local, local, and more broadly at what we can do. I mean, I feel like, especially in this time of great upheaval and health risk, that we need to check on our neighbors. And I have many neighbors who are elderly, and I worry about them going to the market. I call on them if I'm going, can I pick up something for you so you don't have to be at risk? I know how to sew, so I started making some masks for people who I know are really, I have a friend whose husband had surgery and has to be severely quarantined. They couldn't even get out to get masks before all this happened. So I'm gonna make some masks for people I know who need them. But those super micro levels, check on your people. And if you are protesting, don't go out there alone. Set up a buddy system. Have phone numbers on your person, on your body. Write down numbers that, make sure someone's checking on you that got you home. Make sure you check in when you get home at night. So if you don't call, we know we got to go find you. Really on the ground, imperative things that all of us can take small steps to do. And then, as I said, like make places for my students to go when they get out of my class. Let's do some community organizing that can engage people who are willing to learn, knowing that there are so many uninformed folks. And we need to both educate them as well as help them figure out what actions need to be done. And then, give. If you can't make it out of your community at all, like I don't live in a major city. So I'm lucky to still have a job, and I give to those who are less fortunate than me, but there are lots of ways to do things. People are starting book clubs, people are organizing food banks. There are 100 ways. And yeah, so I'm moving toward Instagram, but I'm a Twitter person. And if you follow me on Twitter, I retweet more than anything. So I'm retweeting all kinds of resources for people. If you don't know what to do, follow me on Twitter and look at my feed. I've got lots of suggestions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Twitter seems to be the best place to stay informed these days. I mean, they're moving faster than like the mainstream media always. And, you know, I've seen some really terrific memes where people are like, if you're going to go demonstrate, here's what you need to have. Like, have your backpack with water, with, you know, with a bandana, with a change of clothes, with, you know, all the things. Turn off your cell phone so you're not being tracked. I mean, like all this information. And I think, you know, relatedly, you know, to the suggestions that Vilna offered, you know, I would also say that, you know, I think it's easy sometimes in these moments. I think people really struggle with trying to figure out how to show up. And I feel like we're in a moment when people feel like, oh, I'm going to do the wrong thing. They opt to do nothing at all. Mm-hmm. And I would say, do not allow yourself to fall into that space of political, paralysis, but show up in the ways that you can. And as it turns out, there are lots of ways to show up, you know, and I think that you know, when you live under systems that are so brutal and so inhumane, showing up to provide care to elders, for example, is a really important intervention, you know, showing up and, you know, bringing things to support people who maybe you're not in a position where you feel safe enough to go out in the streets. We are still in a pandemic. It's very likely that we're going to see a huge surge in COVID-19 cases because of the fact that so many people have been out in the streets, understandably so, like they needed to be out there. And there's also going to be consequences for that. So, you know, I think like thinking really strategically about the ways that you can show up, like, and we don't know when these protests are going to end. So maybe you're not showing up in the first contingent of people on the street. Maybe you're the next contingent, or maybe you're the person who's showing up and providing aid and there are lots of people who are showing up and doing first aid for people who've been brutalized in the protests. There are people who are showing up in cities where there has been widespread, you know, looting and vandalism, and, you know, show up and are like, okay, I'm going to help the small local businesses that have been hit. And I'm there to help sweep up glass and help them put up boards and help them rebuild their businesses and show up in those ways. There's lots of ways to be present. So, you know, or getting connected to local organizations that are doing work in the areas of criminal justice reform or prison abolition or, you know, legal reform, whatever. But whatever your lane is, whatever lane you feel like you are, like your gifts are most operational, find your lane and get in it, you know, and do your part.
That's right.
Maybe that's just singing. And making the soundtrack for the movement, and don't let nobody shame you for that. Okay, that is needed. Whatever your lane is, it's all useful.
That's right. That's right. And it's just be engaged, right? No matter how small or large your actionable effort is, it's at least to be present in the moment and to speak up, right?
Just don't look away.
That's right. That's right. Well, on that note, I really just want to say thank you so much to Doctors Vilna Bashi Treitler, Lorenzo Boyd, and Courtney Morris for such an insightful conversation on Uprisings 2020 and its role in our journey of belonging to Blackness.
Thank you so much. This was really wonderful.
I'm really happy I could be a part of it.
Thanks. There you have it. The journey isn't over, but this episode is. Until next time, peace.